The HOA put 12 commercial buildings on my land, but they made one huge mistake. They thought I was just some quiet old man. They tore down my fence, bulldozed the memorial I built for my late wife, and laughed when I showed them my deed. Their lawyer called me a bitter old man clinging to dirt. So I decided to let them finish. I watched them pour the concrete, build the walls, and cut the ribbon for their grand opening. What they didn't know was that every single nail they hammered was just another piece of the trap I was setting. A trap hidden inside the one thing they were too arrogant to ever check. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, because you're about to see a revenge plan come together perfectly. And if you believe no homeowner should ever have their life bulldozed by a corrupt HOA, hit subscribe, because we expose them every single time. I didn't plan on becoming the kind of man who plots in silence, but life has a way of forcing roles onto you when the ground beneath your feet begins to shift. The morning the real battle began, I stood on my back porch, listening to the quiet hum of dawn, trying to feel the peace I used to find in this land. My wife once called it our sanctuary, a place untouched by time or noise, a place where the world paused long enough for us to breathe. But that morning, something in the air felt off, like the land itself was waiting, bracing. I walked the old trail leading to the edge of my property, the one lined with cedar trees my father planted decades ago, and found fresh orange survey markers stabbed into the soil like warning flags. They weren't mine. They weren't county issued. They were HOA markers, thin, arrogant plastic, symbols declaring ownership without earning it. I plucked one out of the ground and held it between my fingers, the cheap material bending as if mocking the weight of what it claimed. I felt an old heat rise in me. Not rage exactly, but the tightening coil of a man who realizes someone is trespassing on more than his land. They're trespassing on his memories. When I got back home, 2 board members were waiting near my driveway, leaning against a brand new black SUV that practically screamed entitlement. They greeted me with forced smiles, acting as though they were delivering good news instead of bad intentions. One of them explained, with a rehearsed calmness that scraped my nerves raw, that the community had expanded development plans and my unused acres were better purposed for commercial contribution. I corrected him. Those acres weren't unused, they were sacred. But he waved my words aside like leaves in the wind. They insisted the decision had already been finalized in a closed meeting I was never informed about. They slid a folder toward me containing glossy mock-ups of buildings I never approved, walkways I never requested, and tenants I never agreed to host. When I reminded them that the land legally belonged to me, not their committee, they exchanged a knowing look, a silent conversation of men who had already decided the outcome. They said, "You can appeal it," one of them said, shrugging, "but it won't change anything." Then came the sound, low at first, like distant thunder, before the machinery crested the hill. Bulldozers, backhoes, trucks. A convoy of destruction rolling toward the heart of my land. I stepped forward, shouting for them to stop, but the engines swallowed my voice. They tore through the fence my father and I built by hand, rails cracking apart like brittle bones. They drove deeper, crushing the path my wife and I walked every summer evening. When they reached the clearing by the stream, the place where her memorial sat, I felt the earth drop from beneath me. The machine operator hesitated for only a moment before a man in an HOA windbreaker gave him a nod. The hydraulic arm swung down and obliterated the bench I had carved for her, scattering wood and memories into the dirt. Something inside me snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. These people thought power came from noise, from machines, from paperwork printed by people who had never stepped foot on this soil. But power, real power, came from knowledge, and they didn't know what I knew. That night, long after the machines were gone,
and the dust settled like ash after a fire. I sat alone at my kitchen table, with every document I owned spread out like a battlefield. Deeds, plats, surveys, records older than most of the board members. I traced each boundary line with my finger, remembering how my father explained them to me as a boy. I found the discrepancies immediately. The HOA's map, the one they had waved around like scripture, was mathematically impossible. Angles that didn't align, measurements that contradicted themselves, signatures that didn't match any county records. Someone had forged something. Someone had gambled everything on the hope that I wouldn't notice. But they forgot who I was. Before retirement, I had spent a lifetime designing systems that had to function perfectly. One flaw, one misaligned number, and an entire structure could collapse. The HOA had built their plans on a foundation of arrogance, and that made their structure fragile. I made calls, quiet ones, precise ones, not to lawyers, not yet, to specialists, surveyors who owed me favors, old colleagues who kept meticulous archives. By dawn, the truth was laid bare. Their map wasn't just wrong, it was fabricated, an artificial boundary line crafted to erase my ownership. They had bet everything on that forgery, and they had broken the cardinal rule of underestimating an old man. They had forgotten old men have time. I began documenting everything: photos, measurements, recorded statements, drone footage. I cataloged the exact locations of every concrete pour, every foundation mark, every violation of the true property line. And as I watched them continue construction over the next weeks, I didn't confront them. I didn't protest. I didn't argue. I let them build. Because every wall they raised, every pipe they laid, every dollar they invested, was a nail in their own coffin. They believed I was defeated. They believed the silence meant surrender. But what they didn't understand was that silence is where plans are born. Revenge doesn't roar, it whispers and it waits. And I waited, watching the very people who stole my land become architects of their own destruction. They built their future on stolen ground, and I was going to take it back, piece by piece, until all that remained was the truth they tried so hard to bury.
I knew the moment the first concrete truck rolled onto my land that the HOA believed they had already won, and that certainty of theirs became the very fuel that kept me moving through the weeks that followed. The silence I wrapped myself in wasn't defeat, it was calculation. And while they erected steel frames and poured foundations like gods shaping a world they thought they owned, I spent my nights in the dim glow of my study lamp piecing together a strategy intricate enough to crush them with their own momentum. The first step was confirmation. True, certified confirmation that the lines they drew were lies. So I contacted an old friend named Warren, a retired county planner with an encyclopedic memory for ordinances and a habit of keeping every document he ever touched in meticulously labeled boxes. He met me behind his old barn and handed over a stack of archived plats and development approvals, each one stamped, sealed, and unquestionably legitimate. The inconsistencies were glaring. The HOA's supposed annexation approval had no corresponding council meeting record, no assessor's signature, no timestamp matching any official filing batch. And as I studied that pile of evidence, I felt something settle inside me, like a heavy stone locking into place. This wasn't just corruption, it was incompetence dressed up as authority. While the HOA strutted through construction zones in their branded vests, pointing at beams and barking orders like generals in a war they believed already won, I walked the perimeter of my land with a GPS unit and measuring tape in hand, recording every coordinate, marking every infraction. By the time the first walls rose, I had a folder thick enough to choke a shredder. But information alone wasn't enough. I needed precision, someone who understood angles and boundary markers the way a musician understands pitch. So I called Nora, a surveyor whose skills bordered on supernatural and whose patience for bureaucratic fakery was non-existent. She arrived in a dust-covered Jeep, set up a tripod, and in less than 2 hours confirmed everything I suspected. The HOA's map was an amateur forgery, the kind created by someone who thought straight lines on a screen could override decades of legal precedent carved into county history. When she finished her survey, she slid her notes across my kitchen table and said, "Ray, they didn't take your land. They just pretended you wouldn't notice." That single sentence felt like the turning of a key, unlocking a path forward I hadn't fully seen until that moment. And from that day on, every passing hour became part of the trap I was quietly stitching together. The construction site grew louder each morning, hammers cracking through the cool air, sawdust drifting across the property line like a taunt, and I watched it all through my binoculars, not emotionally, not bitterly, but analytically, because every misstep they made, every encroachment they committed, every dollar they spent without verifying their own paperwork was ammunition they were freely handing me. Still, I needed one more thing before I could strike: undeniable, publicly recorded proof that the HOA had willfully bypassed proper channels. So I visited the county clerk's office under the guise of researching a property transfer. While the clerk fetched files, I scanned the public logbook and found what I needed.
A blank space where the HOA claimed an entry should be, a gap so obvious it practically screamed fraud. With that knowledge in my pocket, I left the office with a calmness I hadn't felt since before the first bulldozer blade tore into my soil. Meanwhile, the board continued parading around like conquerors. I saw Camden one afternoon pacing across the half-finished parking lot, barking into his phone, pointing to blueprints as if he had personally drafted them. His swagger would have been comical if it wasn't sitting on top of my land. Tina began taking inspection tours, strutting with the air of a self-appointed mayor, waving to contractors while completely unaware of how thoroughly she had doomed herself. Their arrogance didn't bother me, it sustained me, because the louder they became, the quieter I was, and quiet men are the ones people should be afraid of. One evening, after construction crews left and the site fell into a heavy, dusty stillness, I walked down to the stream where my wife's memorial once stood. The ground was torn, the earth raw, but I knelt anyway, placing my palm on the soil as if I could speak to her through it. "I'm fixing this," I whispered, not out of vengeance, but out of love, because what they had destroyed wasn't property, it was memory, and memory deserves justice. Then I stood up and went home, because the next phase required precision. Legal precision. I wasn't ready to hire a lawyer yet. A rookie would burn money, and a good one needed leverage first. So I drafted timelines, organized evidence, built charts, even rehearsed how the story would unfold when the time came. I became a man preparing for war, not with guns or fists, but with paper, facts, and strategy. The following week, as construction neared completion, the HOA sent me a formal warning letter accusing me of hindering community development simply because I had been seen taking photographs near the boundary. The letter, thick with self-importance, was exactly the arrogance I needed. I filed it, categorized it, added it to the growing pile of ammunition. Let them think they were intimidating me. It only made their fall sweeter. The buildings continued rising, 12 in total, sterile rectangles of steel and ambition that cast long shadows across my field each afternoon. The tenants began visiting the site, plumbers, electricians, yoga instructors, real estate agents, each walking the land with excitement, imagining futures they believed belonged to them. I didn't hate them. They were pawns moved by someone else's greed. and pawns always scatter when the king falls. Nights turned colder as autumn settled in, but I barely felt it. My house became a command center filled with maps, recordings, timestamps, weathered legal books, and handwritten notes outlining every move the HOA made. I even installed small motion sensors on my own side of the property line, not to stop them, but to prove the exact moment they crossed it. By the time the grand opening banners went up, my evidence was airtight. Their fate already sealed. And still, I didn't strike, not yet, because a trap is only as effective as the patience of the one setting it. So I let the ribbon-cutting ceremony play out. I watched the crowds gather. I watched Tina pose for cameras. I watched Camden deliver a speech dripping with self-congratulation. And all the while, I stood on my porch, unseen, calm, knowing the foundation beneath their feet wasn't concrete at all. It was paper. Paper they forged, paper I had exposed, paper that was about to bring their entire empire crashing down. And as the applause echoed across land they never truly owned, I whispered the same words that had become my quiet mantra. Keep building. You're only making my case stronger. By the time the applause faded across the plaza and the oversized scissors snapped the ribbon in half, I knew the moment I had been waiting for was finally approaching. The moment when silence would shift into action. When their months of arrogance would collide with a truth they never thought to question. I watched the crowd disperse, tenants shaking hands with board members, contractors taking final photos, the developer laughing loudly with a glass of champagne in his hand, blissfully unaware that he was celebrating atop a ticking time bomb. I stood at my porch window, arms crossed, letting the details imprint themselves into my memory. Because later, these images would matter. A few days after the ceremony, the parking lot was full from dawn to dusk. Cars pulled in and out, yoga clients rolled up mats under their arms. The dentist's office hung a "Now Accepting Patients" sign, and teenagers stood outside the vape shop comparing neon-colored devices. It was surreal seeing life bloom on land that had been mine since long before any of them were born. But I didn't feel anger. Not anymore. What I felt was an eerie calmness, the kind you feel before stepping onto a stage after rehearsing for months. My role was clear now, and I was ready. The next phase began on a cold Monday morning when a letter arrived from the HOA's attorney, a thick envelope stuffed with legal threats dressed in formal language. They accused me of harassment, interference, defamation, anything they could think of to weaken me. I placed it on the table without opening it. My response wasn't going to be a letter. It was going to be a blow they couldn't deflect. That afternoon, I called Marcus Thorne, the attorney I'd been saving for, the moment I finally struck. He answered with the smooth professionalism of a man who dealt with powerful adversaries before. When I laid out the evidence, the forged plats, the mismatched signatures, Nora's survey, Warren's archived maps, the GPS data, the construction timestamps, there was a long silence on the other end I mistook for hesitation. Then Marcus exhaled slowly and said, "Mr. Dalton, this isn't a case. This is a massacre waiting to happen." In that moment, I knew I had chosen the right man. We spent hours organizing the documents, converting everything into certified exhibits, compiling statements, verifying timestamps, and drafting legal arguments strong enough to level an entire board. Each piece of evidence landed on the table like a brick contributing to the wall surrounding them, and by nightfall, the trap wasn't just set, it was flawless. The next day, Marcus filed the quiet title action on my behalf, beginning the process that would force a judge to decide the rightful owner of the land. He also filed a petition for a temporary injunction, ensuring the HOA couldn't sell leases, sign new agreements, or begin additional construction. This wasn't a simple dispute anymore. It was a legal battlefield. The HOA received the papers within 24 hours, and the explosion was practically audible from my porch.
I watched Tina storm across the plaza, waving documents at Camden, her face flushed red with panic rather than authority. Contractors paused mid-hammer as the board members huddled near the parking lot, their voices rising in frantic arguments. Their perfect image was cracking, not slowly, but violently. Camden pointed in the direction of my house at one point, shouting something I couldn't hear, but it didn't matter. His outrage meant nothing now. Everything he was yelling about was already written into motion. That night he posted some half-baked rant on the community Facebook page, blaming false accusations from an unstable resident. It lasted all of 10 minutes before residents began commenting, asking for proof, asking why the annexation documents weren't publicly listed, asking why the construction crossed old survey lines. The HOA disabled comments, then deleted the post, then pretended nothing happened. But the damage spread faster than they could contain it. At the grocery store the next morning, people approached me quietly, some hesitant, some apologetic, some simply angry at the board. They'd been pushed around for years, harassed over mailbox colors, fined for minimal yard discrepancies, reported for trivial infractions, and my fight was becoming theirs. Something had shifted. Their power was dissolving. One evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line, I walked my property one more time, this time with a sense of ownership that felt stronger than any piece of paper. The wind whispered through the pines in a way that reminded me of my wife humming when she used to sweep the porch. I imagined her beside me, her hand warm in mine, watching as justice finally began to move like a slow, unstoppable tide. The night before the hearing, Marcus called with a final update. "He's scrambling," he said. "They're hiring a large firm, but it won't matter. Their filings are dirty, their evidence is non-existent, and judges don't like being lied to." I slept well for the first time in months. When morning arrived, the courthouse felt cold and old in the way buildings do when truth is about to echo through them. Reporters lingered outside, drawn by the viral storm my daughter had accidentally ignited with the YouTube video she encouraged me to post. A video that now had thousands of comments demanding justice. I walked inside wearing my old navy blues, not for theatrics, but because my father always said a man should stand in truth with the shoulders that carried him through life, not the ones that trembled under fear. The HOA arrived minutes later, hiding behind expensive suits and brittle confidence. Tina's smile looked glued on, cracking at the corners every time a camera shutter clicked. Camden wouldn't meet my eyes. He clutched a leather folder like a lifeline. Their attorney, silver-haired, expensive, and smug, greeted Marcus with the kind of politeness predators offer just before striking. But he wasn't the predator today. Once court began, everything unfolded faster than I expected. Marcus dismantled their arguments piece by piece with the precision of a man turning gears in a machine designed for destruction. They objected, they protested, they claimed clerical errors, misunderstandings, miscommunications, but every excuse fell flat under the weight of the truth. And when the judge asked to see the exhibits, I stepped forward with the layered maps and survey overlays, the same ones my friend Eddie had prepared months prior. As the transparent sheets aligned, showing the forged lines, the real boundaries, and the 12 buildings sitting squarely inside my acreage, the courtroom fell into a silence so deep it felt like the air itself stopped moving. The judge stared at the images, then at the HOA, her expression shifting from mild interest to stern disbelief to outright fury. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but every syllable felt like a gavel strike. "This court finds that Mr. Dalton is the lawful owner of the property in question, and that the development known as Evergreen Plaza has been constructed entirely on land for which the defendants hold no legal claim." Tina's face drained of color. Camden sank into his chair. Their attorney looked like he'd swallowed glass. I stood there quietly, not triumphant, not gloating, just relieved. The truth had spoken, and it was louder than any of them.
When the judge's final words settled over the courtroom like falling ash, I felt something inside me loosen. Something that had been locked tight since the first day a backhoe clawed into my soil. But there was no celebration in me yet, no victory pounding in my chest. Justice may have been spoken aloud, but consequences had not yet taken their full shape. And consequences, I knew, were the only language the HOA truly understood. As people in the gallery whispered, reporters scribbled notes, and the developer stood frozen, with an expression of a man who had just watched the millions of dollars vanish into dust, I turned away from the chaos and walked out of the courthouse into the crisp morning air, letting it fill my lungs like the first clean breath after being underwater too long. Outside, cameras swarmed, microphones thrust toward me like spears, but Marcus stepped forward, shielding me with the hand as he gave a brief, pointed statement about property rights, fraudulent filings, and our intention to pursue damages. I didn't speak, not because I lacked words, but because silence carries the kind of gravity that statements rarely do, and I wanted the HOA to feel the weight of mine. When I finally got home, I placed my keys on the same hook they had always hung from, poured myself a cup of coffee, and stood at the kitchen window overlooking the plaza. Theirs no longer, though they didn't know it yet. Watching contractors pack up equipment, confused by the abrupt halt. I knew that by noon, word would spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, and by evening, every resident within a mile would be dissecting the ruling on Facebook, in group chats, and around dinner tables. But I didn't anticipate how quickly panic would ripple through the HOA ranks. That afternoon, an emergency email blasted to the entire community, written in the frantic tone of someone who had lost control but still pretended to lead. Tina insisted they were exploring legal options, that the judge had misinterpreted procedural documents, and that residents should remain calm while the board resolves this misunderstanding. Her desperation leaked through every sentence. Residents responded in droves, demanding explanations, demanding resignations, demanding to know how many HOA fees had been funneled into an illegal development project. I watched from my porch as confusion transformed into outrage. Cars slowed as neighbors peered toward the plaza, inspecting the land they once believed belonged to their association. The facade of power the HOA had carefully crafted over the years was cracking, their authority melting in the sunlight. But I wasn't done. The next morning, with the court order in my pocket, I drove to a local print shop and had eviction notices printed on bright, impossible to ignore paper. Each one contained the ruling, the parcel number, and a firm 30-day deadline for every business to vacate. I didn't blame the business owners. They had been misled just like I had been dismissed, but legality was non-negotiable. That afternoon, I walked through the plaza for the first time since construction began. The air smelled faintly of new paint and asphalt, a place still trying to convince the world it deserved to exist. One by one, I taped eviction notices onto glass doors, while startled business owners watched through windows or stepped outside to read them, their expressions shifting from confusion to dread. Some demanded explanations, others pleaded, a few simply stared at me in disbelief. I explained calmly, because truth doesn't require volume,
That they had signed leases with an entity that did not own the land, and that I would offer each of them a choice: negotiate a real lease with me or relocate. Most knew which option made sense. Word of the evictions exploded online. By evening, the video my daughter convinced me to make months earlier surged again in views, boosted by people sharing updates about the court ruling, the fraud, and the collapse of the HOA board's narrative. Comments poured in, some from neighbors, many from strangers across the country who saw a reflection of their own HOA nightmares in my story. Support came from veterans, lawyers, engineers, homeowners who had fought their own battles and lost. They rooted for me not because I was unique, but because my victory felt like theirs too. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the HOA entered a meltdown. Residents reported shouting from the office late into the night. Emails leaked showing board members turning on one another, each trying to shift blame away from themselves. Tina accused Camden of forging signatures. Camden accused Tina of knowingly approving falsified documents. Another board member claimed both had acted without quorum. Their unity shattered instantly under pressure. 2 days later, I walked outside to find 3 board members waiting nervously near my mailbox, not with confidence this time, but with pale faces and wringing hands. They wanted to discuss options, to avoid mutual destruction, to find a compromise beneficial to all parties. I listened in silence until they finished their rehearsed pitch, then told them plainly that I didn't negotiate with people who stole from me. Their shoulders sagged as the truth settled into them. This wasn't a negotiation. This was judgment, and judgment had already been delivered. The following week, I attended a community meeting, not because I needed to speak, but because I needed to witness what happened when truth finally confronted those who had hidden behind policies and bylaws. The room buzzed with tension. Residents filled every chair, lined the walls, clustered near the doorway. When the board members walked in, the crowd erupted, not with applause, but with shouts. "How could you do this? You used our money! You lied to us! You almost bankrupted the neighborhood!" Tina tried to speak, but every attempt was drowned out by angry voices. Camden stood stiffly, jaw clenched, eyes darting like a trapped animal searching for an exit. For once, their power meant nothing here. I didn't raise my voice, didn't make speeches. I didn't need to. The community handled it themselves. Within an hour, the entire board was voted out. Not one remained. Even after they left the room, Tina trembling, Camden shaking with fury, the outrage continued. People lined up to thank me, apologize, share their own stories of harassment and intimidation. I realized something then. My fight had woken something in them, something HOAs hope their residents never rediscover: unity. The next day, Marcus filed a second suit, this time against the board members personally for fraud, conspiracy, and intentional property encroachment. It was the kind of lawsuit that pierced insurance protections and targeted individual assets. The HOA wasn't footing this bill, they were. And that was when the real panic began. News broke that the county prosecutor had opened a criminal investigation. Reporters camped near the HOA office. Residents demanded audits. The developer threatened a lawsuit of his own. What the HOA had built for years, a kingdom of fear and fines, crumbled faster than any building they erected. And as all of this unfolded, I returned to the only thing that mattered: my land, my home, my peace. I walked to the edge of the stream where my wife's bench had once stood, the ground healing slowly, saplings pushing up through the scarred earth. The silence there felt different now, not painful, not hollow, but hopeful, like the land was finally breathing again after months of suffocation. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I told you I'd fix it." And I meant it. The war wasn't over yet, but I had no doubt how it would end.
In the weeks after the community meeting dissolved the old HOA board into dust, the neighborhood began to shift in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't immediately visible, no dramatic signs, no sudden transformation, but rather a quiet, gradual thawing, like snow melting from the edges of a roof and revealing the shingles beneath. And everywhere I went, people stopped me not with fear or hesitation anymore, but with a kind of relief, as though they'd been holding their breath for years without realizing it, and finally exhaled. Yet even in that newfound calm, I knew my fight wasn't quite finished. The board members might have been stripped of their titles, cornered by the lawsuits and the criminal investigation, but the damage they caused still lingered. 12 buildings standing like monuments to arrogance, contracts voided, tenants displaced, and a community fractured by the people who were supposed to protect it. Meanwhile, the plaza, once bustling and full of artificial life, was beginning to hollow out at the edges. Signs that once boasted grand opening now hung crooked, bleached by the sun, and moving vans rolled through the lot almost daily, hauling away remnants of businesses who chose to cut their losses instead of renegotiating leases with me. Every time a truck pulled out, leaving behind another empty storefront, I felt a strange mix of victory and sorrow. Victory because justice was unfolding exactly as it should, sorrow because innocent people had been misled into investing their futures in stolen land. Still, I honored every handshake offered to me, listened to every concern, and gave each business owner the same calm explanation that their fight wasn't with me, but with the liars who sold them something they never owned. Many left apologizing. A few left angry. All of them left knowing the truth. Meanwhile, Marcus kept me updated on the legal storm brewing around the former board members. Criminal charges progressed faster than either of us expected once the prosecutor reviewed the evidence. False filings, forged signatures, boundary tampering, misuse of HOA funds, and coordinated deception. Camden tried to blame Tina publicly, posting a rambling video online where he said he acted under instructions. Tina fired back with a statement insisting she had been misled by subordinates. Their excuses contradicted each other so quickly that the community stopped listening altogether. It was like watching two collapsing towers fall toward each other, each destroying what was left of the other's foundation. One afternoon, as I was repairing a section of fence the bulldozers had mangled months earlier, my neighbor Frank came over with 2 folding chairs and a 6-pack. He planted the chairs in the grass, handed me a cold bottle, and said, "Feels different around here, doesn't it?" I nodded, wiping sweat from my brow. Frank sighed, looking out at the now quiet plaza. "You didn't just beat 'em, Ray. You broke the spell they had over this place." I didn't respond at first because his words sunk deeper than I'd expected. Maybe he was right. Maybe my fight had become more than my own. After he left, I continued working on the fence until sunset, and as the shadows stretched across the land, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. A peace not born from victory, but from restoration. The next morning, a letter arrived from the county, a certified confirmation that the plaza, all 12 buildings, every inch of concrete, every line of asphalt legally belonged to me. Not shared, not disputed, mine. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into the same drawer where I kept my wife's old photographs. I sat down at the kitchen table afterward, expecting triumph to wash over me, but instead, I felt something different. Closure, maybe, or the soft hum of a promise finally fulfilled. But there was still unfinished business. The day after receiving the letter, I visited the new acting HOA board, ordinary neighbors who had stepped into the chaos with reluctant courage. They were apologetic, disorganized, overwhelmed, but honest in a way the old board never had been. They asked what I wanted: compensation, public apology, community recognition. No. I told them the only thing I wanted was a rule, one ironclad protection so that no one in our neighborhood would ever face what I had again. We discussed it for hours, going through scenarios, loopholes, legal language, until finally they drafted what would later be known unofficially as the Dalton Amendment. No property may be annexed, rezoned, repurposed, or encroached upon by the HOA without unanimous written consent from every affected homeowner. No exceptions, no backroom votes, no procedural adjustments, ever. When the board approved it and sent it to the community for a vote, the result was unanimous. More people voted on that amendment than any HOA matter in the history of the neighborhood. Afterwards, a strange quiet settled over the area, not the tense kind that haunted the construction months, but a healing one. People repainted shutters without worrying about fines. Kids rode bikes without fear of complaints. Neighbors talked again. I started receiving letters, some from residents, some from strangers, many from people in other states fighting their own HOA battles. They wrote things like, "Thank you for showing us it's possible," or "Your video gave us courage to stand up." I never asked for admiration, but I understood why they sent it. HOAs weren't supposed to be predators. They were supposed to serve. But somewhere along the line, many had forgotten that. My story reminded people of something simple. Land isn't just property, it's history, memory, identity. One Saturday morning, after weeks of legal victories and collapsing HOA chaos, I finally carried the new bench I'd built down to the stream. The wood was heavy in my hands, but steady, solid, like something meant to endure. I placed it in the exact spot where my wife used to sit, anchoring its legs into the earth with a quiet reverence. The stream whispered over stone, gentle and constant, just as it had before the bulldozers. I sat down on the bench and let the silence embrace me. I thought about my wife, about the promise I made to her, about how she used to close her eyes and say the water sounded like time moving slowly. I wondered what she would think of everything that had happened, of the plazas or the battles or the courtroom, of the justice finally done. I hoped she would be proud. As I sat there, a breeze rustled the young saplings beginning to reclaim the scarred clearing, and for the first time since this fight began, I felt not anger, not grief, not weight, just peace. The land was healing, and so was I.
In the quiet weeks that followed the restoration of my land, life settled into a rhythm I hadn't felt in a long while. Not a return to the past, but a kind of easing, a gentler breath inside the chest, like everything around me was finally exhaling after months of holding tension in its bones. Yet even as peace crept back into my days, the consequences of what the old HOA had done continued echoing far beyond my property line. Lawsuits multiplied, some from tenants who had uprooted their businesses, others from the developer furious that his multi-million-dollar project had been built on land the HOA never owned. The county threatened sanctions, banks demanded repayment for fraudulent construction loans, and suddenly the same board members who once strutted through the neighborhood with clipboards and authority were scrambling for lawyers, hiding behind statements, and doing their best to disappear from the public eye. Residents whispered about it during walks, in grocery aisles, at mailbox clusters, how Camden's house sat dark most nights, how Tina had been seen driving out of town with her SUV packed to the roof. My name, once muttered in annoyance by those same board members, now traveled with a different weight. Respect, maybe, or something quieter and deeper. Relief. But victory doesn't erase scars, and mine remained each time I walked to the stream and saw the patch where new growth fought to reclaim soil churned by machines. One late afternoon, sitting on the bench I'd rebuilt, I heard footsteps approaching through the underbrush. It was Nora, the surveyor, carrying her old canvas bag and thermos. She sat beside me without asking, her eyes drifting out across the water. For a minute, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "You know, Ray, I've never seen a man take on an entire system and win with this much precision." I chuckled softly, shaking my head. It wasn't about winning, I told her. It was about putting things back where they belonged. She nodded, tapping the ground with her boot. Well, everything's back now. But I knew that wasn't entirely true. Not yet. Because while the land was legally mine again, while the building stood empty and the board had crumbled, there was still one final matter unresolved. What to do with the 12 structures that now sat like ghosts across the field, hollow reminders of everything I had lost and everything I had fought to reclaim. For days I stared at them from my porch, 12 empty silhouettes outlined against the sky, each one a question waiting for an answer. Some neighbors suggested turning them into community centers. Others suggested selling them off. Someone half-jokingly recommended demolishing them and turning the land into the largest garden in the county. But none of those ideas felt right. Those buildings weren't just structures. They were evidence of greed, of negligence, of how easily power corrupts when no one holds it accountable. And as strange as it sounded, I felt reluctant to erase that lesson so quickly. One morning, while cleaning out a drawer filled with old notebooks and photographs, I found a letter my wife had written years ago. It wasn't a love letter or anything poetic, just a simple note about wanting to start a small community program before she passed, something where local kids could learn woodworking, gardening, simple engineering skills. A place, she wrote, where people learn to build rather than destroy. I sat there holding that paper for a long time. And then the idea came to me, not sudden like lightning, but steady, like dawn slowly revealing itself. What if those 12 buildings, born from arrogance and fraud, became places of restoration instead? Not profit, not commerce, but purpose. That evening, under the quiet hum of crickets, I drafted a plan at my kitchen table. By morning, I met with the newly elected HOA board, not to ask permission, but to offer partnership. I wanted the plaza transformed into something for the neighborhood, a community workshop center, vocational classrooms, a shared greenhouse, and a veterans resource hub, and open space for local clubs and initiatives. Not just one project, 12 of them, each replacing a wound with something that healed. The board, still shaken from the chaos of the old guard, hesitated at first, not because they didn't support it, but because they weren't used to seeing a homeowner offer something instead of demanding something. Eventually they agreed, cautiously optimistic. A week later, we held a public meeting to share the plan. People packed the room, filling chairs, leaning against walls, standing in the doorway. I spoke plainly. No legal jargon, no emotional speeches, just the truth. The land had been stolen. I fought to take it back, and now I wanted to give something meaningful to the community that had been manipulated by the same board that tried to break me. When I finished, the room was silent for a long heartbeat. Then applause rose, steady, growing, spilling from every corner until it filled the room like a rising tide. It wasn't applause for me, it was applause for possibility. From that moment, everything moved quickly. Volunteers signed up by the dozens. Retired electricians offered to rewire the interiors. Teachers offered to run classes. Gardeners offered seeds. Veterans offered mentorship programs. Even teenagers showed up with paintbrushes, eager to turn blank walls into something colorful and alive. Each abandoned building gradually transformed into something new, something with hands and hearts behind it, rather than greed. The old dentist office became a woodworking studio. The yoga studio turned into a teaching center for home maintenance and repairs. The vape shop, once a symbol of everything soulless about the plaza, was converted into a tool library where people could borrow equipment for free. For the first time since my wife passed, I felt purpose. Not the kind shaped by obligation or survival, but the kind built from creation, the very thing she had always believed mattered most. And every afternoon, after volunteers went home and the dust settled across the repurposed plaza, I walked down to the stream and sat on the bench, listening to the water move the way time moves, slow, patient, unbothered by the temporary storms above its surface. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast golden light across the clearing, I whispered into the quiet, "We're rebuilding it, Sarah. Not just the land, the people, too." The breeze rustled the young leaves as if answering softly, and for the first time since everything had been taken from me, I felt not just justice, but hope. For days after that moment a fragile hope settled inside me, I walked the land with a different weight in my steps. Not the heaviness of a man carrying loss, nor the rigid stance of someone preparing for war, but the steady calm of someone finally allowed to breathe again. And as the community plaza continued its transformation from a monument of greed into a collective project shaped by willing hands rather than forced signatures, I realized that the neighborhood was undergoing something far bigger than structural repair. It was undergoing a kind of rebirth, a deep reorienting of what it meant to belong here. And everywhere I went, people waved in ways they never used to. Conversations started where silence once lived. Children played near the stream without fear of HOA reprimands. and there was a sense, subtle but unmistakable, that the land itself had shifted from the tight grip of imposed authority to the open palms of shared stewardship. Yet in the midst of this slow, organic healing, the repercussions of what the old HOA board had done were only beginning to ripple outward in wide, unpredictable arcs, because while the new volunteer-led board carried themselves with humility and transparency, their predecessors were now caught in an inescapable tangle of legal fallout, financial ruin, and social disgrace. Lawsuits piled on faster than they could dodge them. The developer filed claims for damages, the bank revoked funding approvals tied to fraudulent plats, and former tenants who'd been displaced began seeking compensation for relocation costs, leaving Camden and Tina drowning under the very paperwork they once used as weapons. Each court summons a reminder that power without integrity is a liability. Meanwhile, even though the plaza had become a hive of constructive energy, the 12 buildings still stood as hollow reminders of what had been taken from me. And I found myself staring at them some mornings from my porch, wondering what their existence truly meant now. Were they scars or opportunities, symbols of harm or foundations for renewal? And as the community filled them with workshops, gardens, and shared learning spaces, I slowly began to see them not as intrusions on my land, but as vessels for something better than the intentions that built them. Still, healing is never a single moment. It's 1,000 small ones. And one such moment came unexpectedly when the father of a little girl approached me near the greenhouse, his daughter holding a small wooden planter box she'd painted in bright, swirling colors. And he thanked me not for winning a lawsuit, not for fighting corruption, but for giving his daughter a place where she could grow something of her own. And that simple sincerity struck me deeper than any courtroom victory, because it reminded me of my wife and how she always wanted the land to mean something to others, not just to us. As seasons shifted and leaves began turning amber and gold, the plaza grew louder with life. Saws humming in the workshop, gardening clubs trading seeds under the greenhouse lights, neighbors holding community dinners in a building once intended for a chain restaurant. And the more I watched, the more I realized that the true reclamation wasn't just the land, it was the people reclaiming their sense of belonging. Yet, even amid this newfound harmony, the shadows of the past lingered at the edges, particularly when news broke that the county prosecutor had advanced additional charges against Camden, including intentional document falsification and boundary fraud, forcing him into a plea deal that left him with heavy fines, mandatory restitution, and the possibility of jail time, while Tina faced her own avalanche of legal consequences, eventually being escorted out of her newly rented apartment by investigators after failing to comply with records requests, her life unraveling in the same slow-motion collapse she once inflicted on others. But strangely, I felt no satisfaction watching their downfall, only a distant sense of inevitability. Because I had never wanted to destroy them, I only wanted the truth to speak louder than their lies. And now it finally had. As these events unfolded, the new HOA board approached me with an unexpected proposal. They wanted to designate part of my land as a protected historical site, honoring not just its original boundary significance, but also the story of the fight that restored it. And while I appreciated the gesture, I declined, not out of pride,